Alright, so these are going to be your Unit 1 notes on the scientific method. And we're going to start just kind of by introducing what is the scientific method. So you have definitely heard this before in other grades, other science classes. The scientific method is the basic process that scientists use to make sense of their surroundings. Anytime a scientist has a question, a problem they're trying to solve, something they're curious about, they use this basic process in order to make sense and understand these questions. But one thing I want to stress is that the scientific method is not specific to science. You actually use this method every single time you problem solve. You just, of course, don't think of it in these intricate steps. You don't pause and say to yourself, gee, now I'll develop a hypothesis. But you are using this every time you problem solve, even the simplest of problems, like why isn't my phone connecting to Wi-Fi? So the basic steps in the scientific method include making an observation, asking questions, developing a hypothesis, developing an experiment, collecting more observations and data, and then analyzing your results and making a conclusion. So we're going to look in a little bit more depth and detail as to what each of these means, what it includes, and I'm going to give you some more real-life examples of how you actually really do use this process. So the first part of the scientific method is making some sort of observation. And we want to make sure in science that we are always making observations and not inferences. An observation is something you actually see, measure, or know for a fact. An inference, however, is an assumption. Just something you randomly pulled out of thin air. You don't really know for sure if it happened that way. You didn't see it. You maybe heard about it. You've made a random guess. We don't ever want to make inferences in science. All of our observations for anything we're trying to problem solve should be based off things we have seen in real time, things we measured, or things we know for a fact from other experiments and studies. So to start with an example, how do you use this in real life? So let's say you're on your phone and all of a sudden Twitter's not reloading, Snapchat's not reloading. So you've made the observation then that your phone is not connected to the internet. You then probably ask a question, why is my phone not connected to the internet? And from that question, you are going to develop a hypothesis. So what is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is a testable statement based on the questions you have about your surroundings. It's going to be a combination of your prediction about what might happen if you do something or test something out. We always put our hypothesis in an if-then format and keeps it nice and organized, and it's easy to identify the different types of variables we'll be looking at in our test or experiment. So I know you're thinking, well, how would I possibly have a hypothesis regarding Wi-Fi? Again, there's no way you are ever out of Wi-Fi and not connected and thinking to yourself, well, let me now establish my hypothesis. But you do this. So again, your question was, why is my phone not connected to the internet? Your hypothesis then might have something to do with a prediction that maybe someone didn't pay the internet bill, and as a result, you don't have Wi-Fi connection. If I put it in the if-then format, it always goes something like, if I do this, then this would happen. So according to this assumption that it has to do with paying the bill, you would assume if someone at home pays the internet bill, then I will finally be able to connect to Wi-Fi. Once we have made an observation, asked a question, and established a hypothesis, we now have a baseline for establishing a test, an investigation, or an experiment. So how do we design and set up experiments in science? Well, first of all, there are some parts in any science lab or investigation you always want to clearly identify and establish. And those are a control setup, variables, and data that you'll be collecting. A control is the neutral, non-tested setup in the experiment. It's something that you aren't going to touch, You aren't going to add anything to it. And the whole purpose of a control is to compare changes that occur in the lab or experiment to this setup. The next thing you want to identify are going to be the variables you're going to be either controlling yourself or observing. We should remember, and we've probably heard of variables in other classes like math, that a variable is anything that changes. So there's a lot of different variables that can impact a science lab. The two we're going to be looking at are called a manipulated variable, which sometimes can be called the independent variable, and the responding variable, which sometimes can be called the dependent variable. The manipulated or independent variable is what you are going to test out or change in your experiment. So going back to our Wi-Fi example, your manipulated or independent variable might be you checking and paying the internet bill and seeing if that gets you some results. The responding or dependent variable is going to be the results of your experiment. It's the variable that responds or happens as a result of you manipulating something. So the responding or dependent variable in our Wi-Fi scenario then would be either getting Wi-Fi connection or not. It's whatever happens as a result of you manipulating your internet bill. The last thing we want to establish in our experiment is going to be the data we're going to collect. There are two types of data that we can collect in any experiment. Sometimes we collect both. It really just depends on the type of investigation and what observations will be made. The first type is qualitative data, and qualitative data is our descriptive data. It's based off purely what we see, things we smell, feel, based off your 5 senses. Examples of qualitative data might be the solution turned blue, there were bubbles, it felt dry and brittle. The second type of data we collect is quantitative data. Quantitative data involves numbers. Anything that was collected from us counting or measuring something. So examples of quantitative data that we might collect would be things like, it was 10 centimeters from the light. There were 37 oxygen bubbles. It grew 5 milliliters. Things like that. After we have established our experiment or investigation and we have completed it, we are then going to collect and analyze data. Our data that we collected then, either qualitative or quantitative, should always be organized in data tables to keep it nice and neat for not only ourselves, but other people who need to go through our data to easily look at and make sense of. Typically, whenever we collect quantitative data, we're going to display it then in a graph. And graphs allow us to really, kind of in a summarized form, visualize and see overall patterns that happen from our observations in the experiment and visually show any relationships that might be going on between the different variables. There are 2 types of graphs that we will be commonly using in biology. The first is a bar graph, and the second are line graphs or scatter plots. Bar graphs are what they sound like. You have used these a million times. They literally look like giant rectangles, either going upward or side to side in a graph. Bar graphs are used to show different results or measurements collected from just different test groups, but nothing in relation to time. So maybe you have 5 different test groups. Each one is testing something a little bit different. So you're going to draw a bar per test group to see what happened in each group. You would use a bar graph. If, however, the observations or quantitative data you collect has to do with periods of time, like a change in a concentration or a change in a measurement over seconds, minutes, days, or weeks, you then want to show that data as a line graph, changing over a period of time. Once we have analyzed our data, we've looked at it in our graphs and our tables, and we've kind of made sense of what's going on, we then can draw a conclusion from our experiment. And this was really the whole reason we conducted our investigation or experiment. We are then going to analyze our observations or data and see if it supports our initial hypothesis. So you're going to notice then there's two different ways this can go. Your data can either support your hypothesis or it can refute it, and that may be a word we're not familiar with. To support your hypothesis means that your observations that resulted from your investigation matched with your initial questions, predictions, and hypothesis. If, however, your resulting observations do not match your initial predictions and hypothesis, you would then say that your investigation and data refuted your hypothesis, in which case you would have to conduct another investigation to try to better figure out what's going on. So let's go back to our Wi-Fi phone scenario, and let's see how this connects. So again, your phone did not connect to Wi-Fi. You asked, why didn't it connect to Wi-Fi? Your assumption was someone did not pay the internet bill. So your hypothesis revolved around if the internet bill gets paid, then you can have Wi-Fi. And your investigation involved being a super sleuth and going through all of your mom's bills, maybe even going through her device to see if she paid online, and possibly slightly aggressively interrogating her in person. After going through all of that, you then have a variety of observations or data you've collected from those experiences, which can either support or refute your hypothesis. Let's say you find out that in fact someone at home did not pay the internet bill. Then that would mean that your observations and data from your investigation supported your initial hypothesis that someone did not pay the bill. If, however, you go through all the bills, someone's device, and interrogate a parent, and you find out that they did pay the bill, which would mean that's not the reason you aren't connected to Wi-Fi, then your observations and data refute your hypothesis, meaning paying the bill or not has nothing to do with why your phone is not connected to the internet. And then you'd have to figure out some other reasons and investigations so you can solve that Wi-Fi problem, because good Lord knows what has changed on Twitter, Snapchat, and all this wasted time. And then we get to really the whole reason we go through these investigations in science. Again, we go through these investigations because we are trying to make sense of our surroundings, and in biology, of living systems, trying to understand how living organisms stay alive, how they complete processes to stay alive, how they interact with the environment, and how that all connects. We call those overall conclusions that explain what's going on scientific theories. And I want to make sure we clear up, a scientific theory is not a guess, it is not an assumption or some sort of nerd fantasy. A scientific theory is an explanation that is supported by a variety of experiments. And if I pause for a minute, let me tell you, when I say a variety of experiments, I'm talking about hundreds to thousands of experiments that have been conducted by not only one scientist, but hundreds of scientists, and then thousands to millions of pieces of data that have been collected, all supporting one explanation or scientific theory. The reason in science we call everything a scientific theory is simply because there is this understanding that as new technology is developed and more investigations are completed, it is completely possible that we will discover new explanations, new data that may require us to go back and alter the original scientific theory. As an example, gravity is a scientific theory. But I'm pretty sure not one of you questions whether or not gravity exists, whether or not if someone pushes you hard enough, you will fall on the ground. But again, we're not calling it a theory because we're not really sure if gravity is real. We're calling it a theory because there's always that opportunity that as we discover more about our understanding of physics, the earth, and the universe, that we may find out things we did not know before about gravity. And again, that is the whole purpose behind the scientific method, to conduct detailed thorough investigations to make sense of things we don't understand about our surroundings.